out to hear me talk about this topic. And my plan for today was to talk about Faulkner's trip to Japan, as well as my trip to Japan, the connection to Faulkner that got me to Japan, and then to give you kind of a shortened version of one of the lectures that I did while I was in Japan that was kind of a comparison of Faulkner and a Japanese author. So I promise it's a shortened version of that part. And then, of course, I'll be glad to take any questions from people too. Let me know if you have trouble hearing. I'm going to be changing the slides as I go, so I'll try and talk into the microphone also. The unique bond between William Faulkner and the Japanese people began, as Jill said, in 1955 when Faulkner visited Japan at the request of the United States Information Service, which is now part of the State Department. He spent almost 4 weeks and visited the cities of Tokyo, Nagano, and Kyoto, meeting with members of the press and students and professors of literature. Faulkner had been awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, of course, in 1950, and his visit just 10 years after the end of World War II was designed to further repair the relationship between the two nations. Many in Japan were honored to host the renowned novelist, and the plan was for him to speak at the annual seminar in American literature the U.S. government sponsored for Japanese teachers of English language and literature in the mountain resort town of Nagano. Faulkner's visit was successful in the sense that it initiated a connection between Faulkner and Japan that remains strong to this day. The visit was not without its problems, however, mostly due to Faulkner's inability to stay sober. Faulkner, of course, struggled with drinking and alcoholism for most of his adult life, and his drinking was a major cause of his death at age 64. So I do not want to trivialize or make light of his serious drinking problem, but there are some amusing tales from his time in Japan. Faulkner was assigned an escort for his time in Japan, a State Department employee named Leon Picon, who quickly realized that the main part of his job would be to keep the world-famous author sober. Faulkner was drunk when he exited the airplane in Tokyo, and on the ride to the hotel, he confessed to Picon that he had a drinking problem and needed help to not drink too much while he was in Japan. At the hotel, Faulkner opened a suitcase that was full of liquor bottles, and Picon took them when he left. When Picon returned the next morning to take Faulkner to a meeting with the U.S. ambassador, he found the Nobel Prize winner wandering the halls of the hotel naked by some accounts and quite inebriated from alcohol that he had clearly stashed somewhere else. Picon was able to get Faulkner dressed and to the interview with the ambassador, which turned out to be a disaster as Faulkner barely said a word. Faulkner was due to give a press conference that afternoon, and the ambassador was very worried. Faulkner hated public speaking, and this was likely the main reason he had gotten so drunk. Picon tried to help Faulkner sober up, but just as it was time to leave for the press conference, Faulkner vomited all over himself and his room. Picon read Faulkner's planned speech to the press club himself instead, with predictably bad press as the result, as reporters had come from all over Japan and indeed all across Asia to hear the famous author speak. The rest of that afternoon was spent sobering Faulkner up before a reception at the ambassador's house that evening. The public affairs officer in Tokyo, named G. Lewis Schmidt, remembers Faulkner sobering up remarkably, graciously talking with his family and others before the reception. Schmidt also gave explicit instructions to the waiters at the reception not to serve Faulkner any alcohol, but remembers in his own words that I had no sooner gotten him into the receiving line when the waiter handed him a very tall and strong gin and tonic. I glared at him, but I didn't. Thankfully, that did not happen. But during the dinner, Faulkner just gestured wildly while telling a story and spilled a drink on the ambassador's wife, ruining her new, specially made, imported dress. Faulkner was ushered out early. The ambassador was understandably furious and was nearly ready to cancel the rest of the visit and send Faulkner home on the next plane. Pecan and Schmidt talked him out of it, and Pecan was able to keep Faulkner's drinking to a minimum the rest of his stay in Japan. They traveled to nearby Nagano for the seminar, where Faulkner's performance with the Japanese scholars over 10 days was described as tremendous, winning over his audience and generating great press with the event. The transcripts that exist from the events show Faulkner responding to a wide variety of questions from his Japanese audience, from specific questions about particular novels, to questions about race relations in the U.S., to broad philosophical questions about truth and art. I was fortunate enough to travel to Nagano with some Japanese Faulkner scholars during my trip this summer, and I found it very exciting to see some of the same sights that Faulkner did. The hotel that he stayed in is now a post office and pickle store. Post office is appropriate, the pickle store not so much. So on the left is a picture from the film Impressions of Japan. And this is the same building today, and you can tell it's largely in the same state, but not a hotel anymore. The buildings of the town, though, remain largely the same, as this is in the older section of town that attracts tourists on their way to the nearby Zenkoji Temple. And these are some pictures from the temple area, and you can see the kind of old cobblestone streets that lead up to the temple is the older part of town where the hotel was, and then a couple shots of the hotel itself. And you'll notice the Buddha statues are wearing these hats. And the temple is the home of the god of children, so these are children's clothing that the statues are wearing. The Nagano Public Library also has a really nice display of materials and photographs related to Faulkner's visit. Here's a few of them, and some myself and the Japanese Faulkner scholars who made the trip with us to Nagano. And so a whole corner of the library has a lot of Faulkner criticism by Japanese authors, translations of the novels, some English copies of works, to photographs from the time he was there. This photograph in the middle is signed to the maid who was assigned to him at the hotel. He gave her that signed photograph, and it's now on display there, as well as some other photographs from that time period. And they also have some old copies of the Faulkner newsletter up on the wall there, and imagine my surprise when looking and seeing a story about Southeast Missouri State University acquiring the Brodsky collection. So I traveled to the other side of the world, and there's my neighbor, friend, and founding director of our center, Bob Hamlin, staring back at me in Japan. So he got a kick out of that when I sent him that picture and told him I couldn't get away from him, even though I came all the way to Japan. The highlight of the display in the museum, though, is this scroll. And luckily, I visited with the Japanese Faulkner scholars who were able to speak to the head librarian there, and she graciously opened the display case and took the scroll out for us and let us look at it up close and take some pictures of it, which was wonderful. The scroll was signed by many of the members of the seminar that Faulkner gave, and was presented to him at the conclusion of it. And Faulkner kept the scroll at his home in Oxford for many years, and it actually stayed in Oxford until 1987, when his stepson Malcolm arranged to have the scroll returned to Nagano by noted Faulkner scholar James Merriweather. And so it's been back in Nagano since then. And I've got a few close-ups of some of the messages, which I thought you guys might get a kick out of. Let me see where. "You are more generous than we expected," says one of them. That's good. "Best wishes to Yatna Papatha." A little poem that someone wrote for him. And then this one is my favorite, I think. "You seldom smile, and I like it." So Faulkner wrote 2 essays during and about this trip, Impressions of Japan, and the other one's called To the Youth of Japan. Impressions of Japan is they're both very short pieces. Impressions of Japan is kind of a disconnected series of reflections on Japanese culture and customs. The text of that short essay provides most of the narration for a short film that was produced by the State Department, also called Impressions of Japan, that you can find on YouTube. And it has some nice images of his trip there. Faulkner is particularly taken by the farming still done by hand in Japan, and he compares the rice fields of the Japanese countryside to the cotton fields of Mississippi. He says nature is the same, only the economy is different in that essay. In To the Youth of Japan, Faulkner discusses one reason that his work may appeal to Japanese in the 1950s. Faulkner writes of a South still grappling with the legacy of defeat in war, a South still struggling with Reconstruction, a South coming to terms with its own sins and misdeeds and crimes that precipitated the Civil War. And he says, I believe our country is even stronger because of that old anguish, since that very anguish taught us compassion for other peoples whom war has injured. I mention it only to explain and show that Americans, from my part of America at least, can understand the feeling of the Japanese young people of today that the future offers him nothing but hopelessness, with nothing anymore to hold to or believe in. He goes on in the essay to offer optimism and encouragement and says nothing, war, grief, hopelessness, despair, can last as long as man himself can last. Echoing his Nobel Prize speech from a few years earlier. And he even goes on to predict that a new group of Japanese writers would emerge on the world stage in the aftermath of the war, because of the war even, he says. And this prediction proved correct. One of the writers who did emerge after the war was the focus of several of my lectures in Japan. But before I talk about that writer and how he compares to Faulkner, I want to briefly explain the purpose of my visit to Japan. Faulkner's enduring legacy and popularity were really the bedrock of the trip. Faulkner remains quite popular among Japanese academics who study American literature. Following his winning of the Nobel Prize in 1950, Faulkner's works were translated into Japanese earlier than they were in many other countries. In fact, at least 2 novels have been translated in the 1940s prior to his visit, and his work was popular among some writers and intellectuals even in the 1930s. Some of his more well-known novels now have 4 different Japanese translations available of them. The ability to read Faulkner in translation, of course, helped him become a figure of academic and popular interest there. Many students, as well as professors, of course, first read Faulkner in translation before moving on to reading the original English versions. The William Faulkner Society of Japan recently celebrated its 20-year anniversary, and its membership numbers rival its American counterpart. At the Center for Faulkner Studies at Southeast Missouri State, we have partnered with a Japanese-American company, BioKiowa Incorporated, to create a visiting scholar program, and BioKiowa generously provides funding for 1 Japanese Faulkner scholar per year to visit our center and conduct research in our extensive Faulkner archives. This program, which started in 1999, is going to host its 20th Japanese Faulkner scholar this year, and that scholar is selected by the Faulkner Society of Japan. Additionally, our center hosts a biennial conference on Faulkner and another author, and many Japanese scholars have attended our conference and presented their work there. So after hosting many of these scholars, I was fortunate enough to receive an invitation to visit Japan this summer. My visit was supported by a grant for a much wider multi-year program that's studying literature, culture, and the natural environment in a trans-Pacific context. that is examining writers from the US, Canada, Japan, China, Australia, and elsewhere, and the way they portray the natural environment in their works. The coordinator of the grant works in Kyoto, and he helped to arrange lectures for me in 6 different Japanese universities to a variety of audiences, including undergraduates, graduate students, and faculty. And I was lucky that each university I visited, except for one, our host there had visited Cape Girardeau before, and I had been able to host them there as well too. So they were extremely gracious hosts, and we had a wonderful trip. I didn't include too many family pictures, but I did throw in a few at the end, so I'll show you those. Most of my lectures focused on a comparative analysis of Faulkner and Japanese novelist Yukio Mishima. Some of them also included a third author, the Chinese Nobel Prize winner Mo Yen, but I'm going to focus on the Japanese comparison. Yukio Mishima, I'll tell you a little bit about him. Very interesting guy. One of the best known 20th century Japanese authors. He was a novelist, poet, playwright, actor, and model who was nominated 3 times for the Nobel Prize. Mishima's personal life is quite interesting itself, as he was not only a model, but a bodybuilder, expert traditional swordsman, and closeted homosexual or bisexual perhaps, although his wife, with whom he had 2 children, has denied this, but it seems fairly clear through some of his writings. And most notoriously, Mishima started his own right-wing militia group, and in 1970 they took over an army base, apparently hoping to inspire a coup and return Japan to its pre-war constitution. When this attempt failed, Mishima committed the act of traditional ritualistic suicide called seppuku, although it also seems he had been planning his death for over a year, so there's a little bit of disagreement about how that went down. Usually when critics compare Faulkner to other writers, they select authors who employ similar experimental narrative techniques to those that Faulkner is best known for: stream of consciousness narration, multiple narrators, nonlinear chronology, complex structure, and complex symbolism. And while these narrative techniques are certainly important to Faulkner's work, and are even in many ways inseparable from his themes and content, my approach for the lectures in Japan was, and a subsequent essay, was different. Specifically, I examined Faulkner's treatment of the natural world and how this connects to themes of the past, tradition, and history. And in these areas, I suggest there are a lot of similarities with Yukio Mishima. Faulkner's been compared with other Japanese authors over the years who are more experimental in their storytelling, but since that had been done already, I wanted to do something a little bit different for the audiences there as well too. And they assured me they had not thought of Faulkner and Mishima as paired together, but they may have been being polite, but they told me if they found it an interesting comparison. Both of these writers struggle with their relationships to their national cultures, and I suggest they both feel caught between traditions of the past, which they respect, yet also find to be outdated and problematic. And I argue that the ways that both authors work through their attitudes about the past are connected strongly to their portrayals of both the natural environment and their representations of gender. American and Japanese attitudes about the past and tradition are not entirely the same, as we certainly found out on our trip. Although the United States has much less history than Japan, Americans tend to want to preserve old buildings, antique furniture, and similar material items. The preference is for original materials, and in general, the older something is, the more value it has. In Japan, a much older society and nation than the United States, I was somewhat surprised to discover that there is not the same devotion to original materials and old buildings. Instead, even the most important buildings are rebuilt regularly. Some of the most famous temples, for example, are completely rebuilt every 50 years or so. The original design, purpose, and concept of the space is considered important to preserve, but not the original materials themselves. In spite of these differences, Japan in the 1950s was rapidly moving from an agricultural society to an urban industrialized one, a change not unlike what Faulkner had seen in the South of his lifetime. This loss of traditional way of life comes with both a sense of progress and a sense of loss of traditional values. Thus, both societies endured a struggle on both the individual and cultural levels to determine which parts of the past should be held on to and which parts must be discarded in order to move forward. Of course, every culture must make similar determinations, but I find some surprising similarities between Faulkner's art in this regard and that of Yukio Mishima. The two writers share a few biographical similarities, including both of them changing their given birth names, both being rejected from military service, yet maintaining a fascination with the militaristic, and both having strong female influences in their childhood. One of the themes that Faulkner returns to repeatedly in his work is the relationship of individuals to the past, both their own personal past and their family and cultural heritages. While he shows reverence for his ancestors and certain traditions, Faulkner is also known for turning a harsh spotlight on what he saw as the mistakes and problems of the past, especially the sins and crimes of the South. Similarly, critic Donald Keene says that Mishima had a love of tradition, but his novels can also be critical of his cultural past. Both writers grapple with contrasting impulses to revere and preserve the past, as well as to destroy it and cast it aside. The symbolic meanings of nature and the environment are quite similar for these authors, and natural symbolism is connected directly to the oppositions of past and present and male and female that are prominent through the works of both writers. For example, the title of Mishima's novel, Spring Snow, suggests the time when one season is passing into another, the old is changing into the new, yet something of the old still clings on and remains. The protagonist of that novel, named Kiyoaki, is a privileged son who nonetheless was, quote, experiencing the first intimations of his family's rapid collapse. Notably, a huge portrait of Kiyoaki's grandfather and two of his uncles in their military uniforms next to a large map of naval battles of the Russo-Japanese War remind him of the decline across generations in his inferior father and now himself. The quote here, their military dress seemed to him to preclude any possible bond between them and himself. The war had ended a mere 8 years before, yet the gap between them seemed immeasurable. This sense of impossibility of living up to the legendary deeds of ancestors is one that afflicts Faulkner's Bayard Sartoris in The Unvanquished. His father, Colonel John Sartoris, who is modeled after Faulkner's great-grandfather, is a daring war hero who seems larger than life to his son. He was not big, it was just the things he did that we knew he was doing that made him seem big to us. And Colonel William C. Faulkner, the old colonel, was a daring hero of the Civil War and later a novelist who Faulkner looked up to and even emulated. An even more compelling counterpart for Kiyoaki in Spring Snow is Faulkner's Quentin Compson. Both are 19 years old, both are associated with water imagery, both lament the decline of standards in their culture, both have the specter of death hanging over them, and both are virgins. Recall that earlier in the novel Spring Snow, there's a lengthy complaint about the loss of manhood in the current age. Real men and masculinity have disappeared, one of the characters complains. And now the earthy vigor of ancestors has been lost, as over time everything becomes more artificial and less natural, is the way it's presented. And so the solution then is to venerate the natural. So the modern is equated with artificiality, right? And the past and tradition are equated with naturalness. So now things have become unnatural and artificial in the present. So venerating the natural means for both Kiyosaki and Quentin, and for both Mishima and Faulkner, the natural is equated with women and the feminine. And women are repeatedly linked with land and with water and flowers in both Faulkner's and Mishima's work. For a brief example, consider the consistent linking of women and flowers in works by both authors. Quentin is often overwhelmed by the smell of the honeysuckle flowers around his home in Mississippi, declaring his compulsion to escape from the smell, yet still sensing it even over 1,000 miles away in Boston as he prepares for his own death. Flowers and plants are also strongly linked to women in Mishima's Spring Snow. Kiyosaki hides under a cherry tree in full bloom, waiting for his love interest, Satoko, and then kisses her there under the tree. When he first admits to himself that he loves Satoko, his immediate response is to open the window, notice the beauty of a nearby pond, and to smell, quote, the strong, fresh odor of the Zelkovas. In their first sexual encounter, the narrator compares Satoko's kimono to the color of white wisteria, and her flesh has, quote, the resistance of water and clinging plants to the advancing prow of a boat. While potentially such symbolic associations could be positive, the authors show how these in fact limit women's possibilities and even lead to their oppression. Women's natural role is assumed to be purely domestic and subsidiary in the context of the novels, a cultural belief that Faulkner critiques, for example, in The Unvanquished, when Granny and Drusilla make successful ventures out into the male world of commerce and of warfare. During the war, Drusilla cuts her hair short, dresses like a man, and goes to the battlefield with Colonel Sartoris, her older cousin. Granny begins a complicated scheme of acquiring horses from the invading Northern Army, then selling them back to the Army for profit, using forged documents to build an extremely profitable business. So the war allows these women freedom, agency, and independence that they could normally not find. However, it's only temporary, as Granny is killed because of her trading, and Drusilla is forced to marry her cousin John to satisfy the traditional customs of the other women of the town. Especially in his work set in more modern times, Mishima features many women who work outside the home and are financially successful and independent. In Spring Snow, though, which is set in the past of 1912, the women are bound by tradition in similar ways to Faulkner's Granny and Drusilla in The Sound and the Fury. Through such female characters, we can see the other side of the hero worship of ancestors and the past. So through their female characters, the writers reveal the oppression, the limitations, and the injustice of traditional cultural practices. In both Spring Snow and in The Sound and the Fury, unintended pregnancies for women are the cause of crises for Satoko, Caddy, and their families. These women are placed on pedestals, that is, they are made by their cultures into symbols of purity and goodness to the extent that their identities as human beings are erased. Their male-dominated culture wants desperately to see these women as pure antidotes to what they know is a contaminated culture. Thus, men police women's sexuality because their sexual activity will bring dishonor to men. When Satoko becomes pregnant, the concern is that her fiancé will end their engagement, and that, quote, your father would have to hide himself from the eyes of the world, and that the future hopes of her lover will be ruined. Similarly, when Caddy Compson becomes pregnant, the impact on the lives of her brothers is the main focus of the novel. Benji attacks a neighbor girl in his desperation to replace his lost sister. Quentin is so tormented by his sister's supposedly stained honor and his inability to protect her that he kills himself. And Jason blames his sister's pregnancy for every misfortune in his life. Faulkner and Mishima, however, do not necessarily share the views of their male characters. Rather, I would argue they reveal the damage and pain caused by outdated patriarchal rules from the past, which some still choose to cling to in the present. Both authors are rather sympathetic towards their female characters, who doom themselves through nothing more than normal human desires and activities. The idea that women should be pure counterpoints to unclean men aligns women with nature. That is, pure nature is constructed as an antidote to artificial and contaminated culture. Faulkner and Mishima, however, show women to be just as capable, or even more capable, than men if given a chance in a so-called man's world, though they also show women to be just as flawed as men too. In other words, they are just as human as men, though the traditional cultures of the US and Japan do not always treat them that way. Turning now to men, Faulkner's and Mishima's novels are filled with father figures who are already dead and father figures whom sons wish to kill, symbolically or literally. Fathers and father figures, I would suggest, represent culture, and as we have seen, Faulkner and Mishima express ambivalent attitudes toward the traditions and beliefs of their cultural pasts. Thus, the desire or relief for the death of the father should be understood not just psychologically in a Freudian sense, but also culturally as a rejection of the past that young people find constraining or even smothering. Thus, we see a surprising number of dead fathers, including those of both Ryuji and Noboru in Mishima's The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea, Shinji's father in his novel The Sound of Waves, and Mizoguchi's father in his novel The Temple of the Golden Pavilion. For Faulkner, the list of fathers already dead or killed includes Jason Compson from The Sound and the Fury, John Sargeras in The Unvanquished, Ab Snopes, Thomas Sutphin, Sam Fathers, Joe Christmas's unnamed father and his adopted father, possibly Simon McEachern, Joanna Burden's father, Gail Hightower's father, and Lena Grove's father, all from Light in August. A dead or missing father leaves the son without cultural guidance or tradition, but it also leaves him free to choose his own new path. Thus, we often see sons in both Mishima's and Faulkner's works who wish to kill their father or substitute father figures. And there are a few important examples of fathers who die dishonorable deaths in ways that suggest a symbolic break from tradition and the past. Jason Compson in The Sound of the Fury dies a slow and pathetic death of an alcoholic who drinks himself to death because he cannot handle the decline of his once proud family. Thomas Sutphin in Absalom is murdered not by his own son, but by another father protecting his daughter. And Joe Christmas attacks his stepfather with a chair in Light in August, an act of revenge for years of abuse. Joe's biological father is killed in an ambush by Joe's grandfather, and Joe becomes doomed to search for his own identity and for meaning in his life until his own violent death. These dishonorable deaths in Faulkner are mirrored by the cowardly murder of Ryuji, the replacement father of Noboru in The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea. Noboru and his friends in that novel, all male, deceive and drug Ryuji in order to kill him in an act that symbolically culminates their rejection of the older generation and the traditions of the past. Here's a quote: "Fathers and teachers, by virtue of being fathers and teachers, were guilty of a grievous sin. Therefore, his own father's death when he was 8 had been a happy incident, something to be proud of." These symbolic rejections of culture through the deaths of fathers, along with their portrayals of women confronting stifling, unjust, and even unnatural gender roles, are good examples of how these two authors exhibit similar condemnations of the past and of traditions they feel no longer have a place in modern culture. Faulkner, of course, is well known for his criticisms of slavery and its legacy of racial injustice in ways that cast castigate not just the South, but the United States as a whole. In his lifetime, Faulkner was not always well liked by many of his fellow Oxford residents and Mississippians, largely because they disagreed with his views on race that he expressed in his fiction and public comments. These days, Faulkner's views on integration, which could be categorized as gradualist or of the go slow approach, are sometimes attacked as too retrograde, not progressive enough. Faulkner was not afraid to cast a harsh light on his home and its past. Mishima and Faulkner both feel a reverence for the past, clearly, and their ancestors. But Mishima, I think, seems more invested in reviving the values of the past, which he sees often as superior to those of the present. Faulkner's views are more complex, more ambiguous. In his fiction, Faulkner utilizes multiple perspectives, multiple interpretations of the same events. So pinning down his views through his fiction is always tricky and complicated. Even in his letter writing, his interviews, and his nonfiction, Faulkner is notorious for contradicting himself, changing his story, and even just flat out lying. Mishima, on the other hand, is more dedicated to a particular point of view, clearly so in his life, if less so in his fiction. I think Faulkner would have jealously admired Mishima's pure sense of conviction, the certainty of his beliefs, and his willingness to act on them, although he likely would not have agreed with Mishima's forming of his own small private army and desire to return Japan to its pre-war constitution. For years after his death, Mishima's views made him unpopular, but new generations of Japanese, too young to have lived through World War II and too modern to be shocked by his writings about sexuality, do not consider him to be nearly as controversial anymore as he once was. Of course, it's understandable why, in the decades following the war, Mishima's wish for a return to feudal values and his militarism were shunned by a large segment of the Japanese audience. Both authors' views of the past are strongly influenced by the experience of a wartime defeat and occupation. Faulkner's most productive period occurs about 70 years after the end of the Civil War, almost the same amount of time from the end of World War II to today. Faulkner exhibits disappointment that his home refuses to change and instead clings to the lost cause of the war while creating new ways to enforce old hierarchies and oppression. Over and over again in his fiction, we see warnings of the negative effects of remaining stuck in an unhealthy past. The difference of Japan's attitude 70 years after their defeat in war is striking and perhaps instructive. Their culture provides a model for how to acknowledge a problematic past and use its lessons to create a better future. The area of Hiroshima, one of the cities we visited, that memorializes the site of the world's first atomic bomb detonation, for instance, is called Peace Park. And it's now a moving memorial to those who lost their lives in the bombing. But also, it's an ongoing plea for peace, a repudiation of the militarism that led Japan to attack the United States and that led the United States to use atomic bombs on Japan. The flame that you can see, perhaps see, burning in the photo here, is meant to stay lit until there are no more nuclear weapons on Earth. Of course, the Japanese Constitution was changed following the war as well, renouncing its right to initiate military action, as well as abolishing its monarchy in favor of a parliamentary democracy. So I contrast this with, for instance, the ongoing fights that we are still having over Civil War monuments on public land, right? I was thinking about this as we visited Japan quite a bit. There's no consensus view. There's no national voice or no sense of finality even. And the wounds of the divided nation continue to fester many, many years after our own Civil War. Faulkner, I think, would be disappointed by that lack of progress in many ways. Faulkner saw racial equality as inevitable, even if he thought the process should be a slow one. This quote I always liked of his: to live anywhere in the world of AD 1955 and be against equality because of race and color is like living in Alaska and being against snow. So the nation, like Faulkner, continues to grapple with how to understand the past, how to move forward without discarding what is useful from tradition and history, but also how to not remain stuck in the past. His most famous short story, A Rose for Emily, can be read as a warning about what happens when people cling too much to the dead bones of the past and refuse to change. From his trip to Japan, Faulkner saw commonalities with a vastly different culture, and he found a wisdom in Japanese culture that was universal and timeless. As is often the case, a long journey far away made him see his home in a new way. Thank you for that. With my wife and children you see there, and some Japanese Faulkner scholars as well. And then here, one of the most famous coffee brands in Japan uses a logo that looks suspiciously like Faulkner there, doesn't it? And so I think they took a famous image of him and tweaked it enough to not get sued. And it's called The Boss, which I thought was great too. So I was drinking The Boss the whole time we were in Japan and stayed loyal, and brought a few cans back as souvenirs as well too, but I thought that was quite humorous. So we were walking the streets and Faulkner's face was on vending machines everywhere we went. You could not get away from him, which was kind of funny.
Did you say it was coffee in a can?
Coffee in a can, yes.
So they serve it cold?
Sometimes in the morning the cans were hot, which I didn't know until I picked one up, and that was kind of weird. But yeah, most of the time it was cold. It was in vending machines or in convenience stores, and there were 20 different varieties and flavors, but almost always cold. Once or twice I found those hot cans, but other than that, the cold coffee in a can was very popular. And they were very tiny little cans. You're meant to just get one out of the machine, drink it immediately, throw it away, and keep going.
Did you see any research?
I'm curious as to why the Faulkner Center is in Cape Girardeau. William Clark Faulkner supposedly came from Girardeau or close to there.
Yes.
The stories kind of vary, but is that why it's there? Or is it...
No, that is a good question, and one we get asked a lot, actually. Yeah, the family had roots in St. Genevieve, Missouri, which we can document that pretty well now, the family connections to St. Genevieve, which is about 30 minutes from Cape Girardeau, where we are. And then they made their way to Ripley from there, as best we can tell, although I'll defer to Jack on that, actually. But,
no objection.
Okay, good. And so the way we wound up with a Center for Faulkner Studies in Missouri is there was a big Faulkner collector named L.D. Brodsky, who was from St. Louis and Farmington, Missouri, lived in both of those places, and over the years put together, I think what's generally acknowledged as the largest Faulkner collection that an individual has ever amassed. And that, Dr. Hamlin, my predecessor at the center, was a professor at Southeast Missouri at the time, and it was one of his students put him in touch with Brodsky and said, you know the Faulkner collector who lives in Farmington, which is just a tiny town about the size of New Albany, not too far from us. Those two got together, Dr. Hamlin and Brodsky, and started working on his collection. And it was really the partnership and the friendship they formed over many years that Brodsky decided to donate the collection to Southeast rather than, he talked with Ole Miss for a while about donating it there. He talked with Yale, his alma mater, about donating it there. But eventually we acquired the collection, and as part of his gift, the center was established. Brodsky really didn't want his collection to just sit in a room somewhere and no one ever sees it again. So the center's mission is to tell people about the collection, publicize the fact that we have it, and also to bring people to use it in Cape Girardeau. It's not always easy to get people to come to Cape Girardeau. So we try to lure them there with the collection by hosting a conference and bringing the Japanese scholars, and we have a lot of Chinese scholars who come as well. Yes.
I wanted to ask a question about the Japanese scholar program. When they come there, what, or they have a project in mind, or and do y'all choose which projects that you want to move forward with? How does that work?
That's where the Japanese Faulkner Society helps us quite a bit. So the scholars who are interested have to apply to the Faulkner Society, and then they're chosen. So it is usually to work on a very specific project, a book or an article, and there needs to be something in our collection that they need access to help with their project. Although it can be kind of general, but yes, the idea is that they're working on something specific, because the funding really provides enough for a 10-day or 2-week visit, and that's about it. And so they usually have a very targeted research topic in mind when they come. And then I usually try to bring them down to Oxford to see Roanoke and some of the sites there as well while they're visiting. But that's how that works. There's a specific project they're working on. Yes?
I'm reading the Joseph Faulkner, and I'm on, it's 700 pages, and I haven't
You got
gotten
the short version.
Yeah. I got the
2 volumes even
version.
longer.
I didn't get to 1955 yet.
Mm-hmm.
Did Estelle go with him to Japan?
No,
Probably not.
No, that he just goes by himself.
Okay.
Jill went on some of the trips, though, I think. He also went to
Right.
Venezuela and the Philippines and Greece. I'm leaving one out, I think. But all sort of part of these same State Department initiatives. Yes, Jeff?
You compare Mishima to, showed him juxtaposed with the World War II and the transition after that. The real, in my mind, the real watershed in terms of Japanese culture is the Meiji Restoration and overthrow of the Tokugawa shogunate in the late 1850s. Would that have played any role in his thought?
In Mishima's?
Yeah.
I think he has a fascination with that early period. I think that would be a really interesting comparison to make as well, too, because the timing is more contemporaneous with the U.S. Civil War,
Right.
and is equally seismic, aftershocks for the population
It
there.
really changed things.
Yes, majorly. And so, yeah, I think that would be, now, Mishima doesn't write about that. He doesn't go back that far in his fiction. At least none of the 8 or 9 novels that I read ever goes back to that. So he doesn't seem to have that same kind of historical obsession that, Faulkner seems to keep returning to these pre-Civil War and Civil War moments over and over again in the fiction, whereas a lot of Mishima's work is set more in the 50s and 60s of Japan, and a few historical novels. His most famous tetralogy of 4-novel sequence is more historical, but a lot of it is quite contemporary as well, too. But it's often set in rural areas. Often, one of them focuses, for instance, on women who dive for abalone and other things from the sea in this very, very traditional way, and the way that's being changed and threatened by modernity. And so those are the themes that I thought were really interesting to compare with the way Faulkner treats the same things. Both of them I feel are very conflicted, about the past and tradition and ancestors. And there's this tendency on the one hand for almost hero worship of the old colonel in particular, but then also the opposite too, and that was what I kept seeing over and over in both of them. Yes, sir.
This question has to do with Faulkner and Albany. In Faulkner's original 2-volume book, it's been probably 20 years since I read it.
Yeah.
He has a version of the Faulkner, Murray Faulkner and Maud Faulkner and young William leaving New Albany, having to do with Murray getting shot over here on the bank.
Right.
And some of the Faulkner family wasn't too happy with that, so when he got around to the little book,
Yeah.
He had changed that quite a bit. Do you have any idea which version of that story is true?
Oh,
Your collection?
yeah. I mean, we don't have anything in the collection that pertains to that specifically. I think, different people seem to remember it differently. I think the original one volume is probably the best information that Blockner found. And then, as you said, the change in the two volume, in the two volume, the original two volume is probably the best information he found. The change to the one volume later probably did result from people, not being happy with it. And Blockner, of course, was friends with the family, and so he feels maybe a little bit more pressure to be friendly in some ways. But yeah, I mean, I think there's other documentation of that incident with Murray that you're talking about there. Now, whether that is the cause of them leaving, I guess, is maybe more debatable. But I think that did happen, though.
I could comment on
Yeah.
that. There are two different versions of the same, or more or less the same shooting. Some guy gets mad at Murray and comes in and shoots him. One's down in Pontotoc, one's in New Albany. There's plenty of primary source material on the shooting in Pontotoc. Newspaper accounts given day by day. There's an account in the circuit clerk's office in the docket book. There's nothing about this supposed shooting in New Albany. I don't know how it ever got started, but as early as I can find it at all is from the 1950s. We looked at that book that, which is a minor that Faulkner mentions it and everything, and then subsequent retellings it got bigger. But I don't believe that happened at all. And so it had nothing to do with their leaving New Albany. The whole reason they left New Albany was Murray Faulkner got promoted to be auditor of the railroad, and he moved up there to the headquarters in Ripley. That was in late, about December of '98.
I expect you're right.
But I've really pondered on this. How in the world, you have two stories that are almost identical, but said in two different towns.
Well, and there's a story about J.W.T. Faulkner coming over here on a handcar with a couple of railroad employees, bringing him over here to check on Murray.
Oh,
Yeah,
all
most
history's
of the
that way,
stories that Blockner used were oral sources. He did not get back to the newspapers from that time, and you can really straighten things out. You know the date it happened. Blockner didn't know the date. And the story about J.W.T. Faulkner coming over actually took place some days later, and when he got in a shootout with J.E. Walker on the square in Pontotoc was actually weeks later, and they were both hauled in the court and fined $500, which is with the promissory that they weren't supposed to try to kill each other again. But that's Pontotoc Circuit Court record.
Or if they try, one of them ought to succeed.
I was showing you guys some of the new and the old that was so fascinating about Japan when we went as well too. That in some places we went, it was the most modern, futuristic, setting we had ever seen in some ways. And then you had these temples, or this one on the left is in Kyoto, which is kind of the old capital of Japan, and lots of historic sites to see there, more than any other city probably. And in fact, in Kyoto, we bought some incense from a store in Kyoto. The store has been there since 1575, so selling incense. So the old and the new together was really quite fascinating about the trip too, and got me thinking about these themes in different ways as well while we were there and after. Interesting, and there's some disagreement about whether this was kind of an act of protest and that he had planned the suicide all along, or whether he really was attempting. And I think I find that explanation more persuasive, that he was not actually attempting to overthrow the government, although that's how it was presented at the time. And then when this failed, but he was making a speech at this army base, and some of the accounts have some of the soldiers in the audience laughing as he's speaking, and that clearly there was not a lot of agreement with what he was suggesting. And then he has one of his followers,
His boyfriend.
by some accounts, yes, so that he kills himself, and then he is decapitated there by one of the followers immediately. But there's also writings that he did that suggest he had been planning all of this for about a year, that he finished his final work of fiction, for instance, a few weeks before this event occurred. So I think originally it was presented as this spontaneous act, that when his coup attempt failed, he killed himself in response. But now it seems probably a little bit more likely that he did not expect it to succeed, and he was doing this more as a protest more than anything. But very, very interesting guy, for sure.
Yeah, a bona fide nut, right?
I'm not saying that. I will let you say whatever you want. Very interesting guy, let's just say that. Lots of artists are, bona fide nuts, I think, to use your phrase. Some people accused Faulkner of that too. So. Well, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate your coming out and asking questions and being interested. I'll be glad to talk to anybody afterwards as well if you want to stick around too, but thank you.